Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Benvinguts y benvingudes. Today we have just Moorkens with us. We are sorry about the technological problem. We will be talking about ethics and technology, and we can now ask the questions. Is it ethical for technology to leave us in the moment we need it the most? Think about it. So, yeah, let me just say a few things in Catalan and then I will continue in Spanish. Es un gran placer presentar-vos el nostre convidat, en Joss Moorkens. Li agraïm molt la seva participació avui i moltes gràcies per ser aquí. Thank you very much for being here with us, Joss. Joss is one of these academics who, I know it's very cliche to say, but he needs no introduction. He is an associate professor at the School of Applied Language and Intercultural Studies in its short name in Dublin City University. And he's a founded investigator and science lead at Adapt Center, which is a big research center in Ireland, which I was luckily part of it for a very short time. And he's the co-author and co-author of over 60 journal articles, book chapters, and conference paper on translation technology, human factors in translation technology, and machine translation, and translator precarity, and translation ethics, about which he will be talking about a bit. And he is the co-editor of Translation Spaces, and also he co-authored I would say lots of textbooks as of now. So translation tools and technologies and automating translation. There are new books that I totally recommend you to read about the new developments happening in technology and translation. And finally, the last thing to say about him maybe would be he's a board member of the European Masters in Translation Network. And he's also in the advisory board of Journal of Specialized Translation. And today he will be talking about the three bottom line when you are evaluating technology. Specifically, in our case, it would be like automatic translation and other aspects of technology, maybe. And he will be showing us, like, he will be giving weight to people, planet, and performance in his chat. And the floor is yours. Just thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, Gökhan. Thank you to you, to Judith and your group for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for sticking with me today, despite these technical difficulties, and to everyone online who I hope can hear. It's great to see some familiar faces there. So I'll talk a little bit about our idea of a triple bottom line for translation technology in a roundabout way over the next sort of 40 minutes or so, talking about LLMs and machine translation, where the idea of the triple bottom line came from, how we've applied it to translation technology, and looking towards sustainable translation technology. So this is going to be a familiar diagram for many of you, but just for those that it isn't, it's a potted history from freecodecamp.org of the history of machine translation, going from rule-based machine translation, which, well, it was just machine translation at the time. It's now a retronym that we've applied to it. Example-based, statistical, and neural machine translation. So we've moved from rule-based to data-based machine translation, but also from symbolic to sub-symbolic artificial intelligence. So symbolic artificial intelligence is using technology that can be read, we can understand what's happening, whereas sub-symbolic, the very first thing that happens is that words and sentences are converted to numbers, to sequences of numbers upon which thousands upon thousands of operations are carried out. So we can't really see what's going on. So there's opacity that's baked in from the very outset once we move to machine learning and neural networks. Another change that's happened over the last number of years is a move from university research centers being at the forefront of NLP and machine translation research. So if we look at the competitive shared task, WMT, for English, German, for 2016, we can see at the top of the leaderboard where people are pitting their different research centers are pitting their systems against each other. We've got University of Edinburgh, NYU, Cambridge, KIT in Karlsruhe in Germany. Going forward in time to 2019, we now have big tech at the top of the leaderboard as the locus of development moves towards big tech in MT research. So Facebook, Microsoft, there's still a couple of university sectors. We've University of Cambridge there. E-translation from the European Commission is coming in there as well. And now in 2024, the most recent, GPT, Dubformer, Transmission MT, we've got the plucky little 100 million funded Unbabel as the upstart and LLM that's in there. So we've moved to LLMs at the top of the leaderboard, and also big tech as the locus of technology, as the sort of center of development. And something else you'll notice going from one to another is that the way these systems have been evaluated has changed. So here, this was based on string-based metrics. So you had a reference translation, and we're comparing a human reference translation, and we're comparing the machine translation to it, trying to see how similar it was. But here we're moving on to something called direct assessment, where a load of people on the cloud, it's crowdsourced. A lot of people are trying to rate the MT output between 0 and 100. And now we've moved to a sort of a mixed assessment. So we had direct assessment with this scale of 0 to 100. And the best practice in the industry and human evaluation is this sort of annotation of different types of errors, deciding if they're major, minor, and then using a number of different categories. But this is expensive. So the current best practice for these sort of competitive shared tasks is now this combination of a scale of 0 to 100 and then a very quick annotation of errors. But trying to figure out how to evaluate machine translation is becoming more and more challenging. Another big change moving to LLMs is that the focus on scale and just scaling up larger and larger systems, for some reason that hasn't been entirely explained, suddenly there's emergent abilities. So here we can see that to do with arithmetic, transliteration, word unscrambling, question answering, natural language understanding. At a certain point in the scale, the output improves. And the assumption is that if we continue to focus on scale, we'll see linear improvements, which doesn't seem to be the case. There's lots of discussion about the limitations of scale, but scale and more data has been the focus of the development of MT and now LLMs for the last number of years. This paper that's been widely cited is highly problematic. There's loads of assumptions about translation in it, that translators will continue to become faster in a linear way as we increase the scaling of systems. But there are lots of assumptions that are problematic, but nonetheless, these sort of headlines are broadly accepted, and this was widely disseminated within the localization industry. And we can see some research that is now running counter the narrative that scale will improve things, like this one from Nature from last year, how larger and more instructable language models have become less reliable rather than more so. So, of course, it's not just machine translation that LLMs can produce. OpenAI have called ChatGPT a general purpose technology. And this harks back to what Langdon Winner wrote about in 1978, that technology is at its most productive when its ultimate range of results is neither foreseen nor controlled. So we are all the beta testers as the LLMs are released into the Petri dish. Positive side effects are a latent expectation or desire implicit in any plan for innovation, but the negative side effects are experienced as necessary evils that we're obliged to endure. And when we evaluate LLMs and machine translation, the negative side effects are generally ignored or not considered at all. We only focus on performance, on these positive attributes, and ignore whatever's negative. For large and well-supported language pairs, we can see that LLMs appear to be the new state-of-the-art for translation and many other tasks, even though they have some of the same problems as NMT to do with mistranslations, to do with hallucinations, and then some other problems as well. But there's a sense that in the industry and in national governments and in international institutions, there's a real sense of FOMO, fear of missing out, to do with AI, a sense that if we don't do it, well, someone else is going to do it. So every large language service provider has got an AI page. Transperfect, which will be a very familiar company for those of you in Barcelona. They've got their artificial intelligence page where they talk about it taking a prominent role in creating and optimizing interactions across many industries. They're using AI to overcome challenges. Although interestingly, they had a blog post in March of last year talking about the danger of just implementing AI for the sake of it. This sense that managers just want an AI product without really knowing what they're trying to do or what they're trying to achieve. RWS, unlock your AI potential, but it's not just LSPs. I was living in Iceland in 2022-23 while I was on sabbatical, and the Icelandic government have partnered with OpenAI. In 2021, the president of Iceland, the head of the largest MT company, and the head of a government department tasked with looking for the survival of Icelandic in the digital domain, went on tour around big tech companies in the US trying to partner with them, and they made a partnership with OpenAI so that when GPT-4 was launched, Icelandic was the second official language, and they gave all of their language data across. And there were some arguments against this. I remember one discussion to do with sovereignty, suggestion that we should have our own national LLM, but the fear was that as a small island, we don't have the capacity to do this. There are problems with cybersecurity. So their decision was to latch onto a big tech company, which means a loss of control. The big tech company is in control of what's going to happen with your language in the digital domain. But they promoted this, and later last year, the Icelandic approach, this playbook for other language communities that want to follow Iceland, was produced. Informally, evaluations have shown that Claude is actually producing better Icelandic output than GPT, despite the fact that they weren't given all the language data. There's huge amounts of money involved. From OpenAI, they raised 6.6 billion in new funding at a 157 billion post-money valuation to accelerate progress late last year. And national governments want in. So Spain wants to be the leading AI hub in Europe, and there are a load of AI targets that our national governments have produced. Interestingly, both Ireland and Spain have set a target of 75% of businesses using AI by 2030. Not that there's a specific need for them using AI, they just need to be using AI for something. So there's a real fear that AI is too big to fail, that there are so many national and international organizations behind AI, that even if it doesn't turn a profit, and it's a huge loss leader at the moment, lots of money has gone in, and it's not produced very much earnings. The public discourse, as Anthony Pym has said, is so vociferous, polarized, so ill-informed and removed from empirical assessment that in the space of public discourse, the technology is assumed messianic or demonic proportions. And he said that in a time of economic stagnation, that national and international organizations are desperate for something that will stimulate growth, and generative AI looks like it fits the bill. But the problem is empirical assessment, how to do that. It's really tricky. And there are a load of metrics with different challenging tasks like MMLU that is being used. And I'll come back to those in a moment. Within the industry, we've got loads of hype to do with new companies. Slater's top AI 50 50 AI companies under 50 months, a lot of them interestingly in the AVT domain, or media localization domain, to do with multilingual video and audio, content, real-time speech translation, localization tech, and then trying to group or put different technologies together within the AI stack. And CAT tools or TMS tools are trying to incorporate AI. There's no consistent way that this has been done, so lots of different efforts. We've got MemoQ, for example, that are creating prompts based on TM outputs or TM suggestions. So up to 6 proposals are sent to GPT with the assumption that that added context will lift the quality. So it's basically being included like MT was previously, below a certain match percentage. Most of them don't include an opportunity to adjust your own prompt. I think SmartCat does. Localize has got different buttons for increasing the length, shortening the length, rephrasing. Lilt they use something called Amazon Bedrock, which is a sort of central point through which you can access lots of different LLMs. And they're using it for multilingual text generation, so that rather than having a linear source to target relationship, you can have a single prompt that will create multilingual output all at once. Mm-hmm. So this is a real change where we don't have this linear source to target relationship. And we currently have a PhD student in Dublin looking into what the potential ethical issues with that are. So over time, we've moved from these string-based metrics where we're just comparing a string of human translation to the MT output, to pre-trained metrics, so pre-trained using neural networks that have shown weaknesses to do with identifying mistranslation or specifically the sort of errors that neural networks create. Expensive human evaluation like multidimensional quality metrics, and these are ISO and ASTM standards that have now incorporated MQM, which is the current de facto standard. And then these sort of composite benchmarks, we've got loads of different challenges together, like this MMLU one, as a sort of proxy for how intelligent systems are. But all of these are based on performance, as I mentioned. There was a paper called Green AI from 2020 by Roy Schwartz and others, where they complained about the exclusive focus on performance when using one type of measure, and how it discourages a holistic approach to AI system development and ignores considerations of efficiency and sustainability in the quest for ever greater performance. And this pushes AI development in the wrong direction. So we're seeing systems that are growing bigger and bigger, more expensive, requiring more emissions, more ICT, more GPU, more compute, without any consideration of what the other effects are on efficiency and sustainability. So I'll come back to that in a moment, and then I want to talk about the other part of where our idea for the triple bottom line came from. So this came from business ethics, where initially the credo was how the social responsibility of a business was to increase its profit. This was Milton Friedman's credo from 1970, that profit was all. By the 1990s, we had the idea of corporate social responsibility put forward by Carroll in this pyramid of corporate social responsibility, where our main responsibility was economic, to turn a profit. And it's the foundation upon which all others rest. So return money to our shareholders. Subordinate to that are legal responsibilities to obey the law, and not just obey the law, but obey the spirit of the law, as law is society's codification of right and wrong. Nonetheless, this is still less important than the economic. Subordinate to legal are ethical responsibilities, follow society's mores and ethics, do what's right and fair and just. And then at the lowest level of important, philanthropic responsibilities, be a good corporate citizen, contribute to education, the arts, the community, to society, improve the quality of life. And there were a few people putting forward this sort of idea from DeGeorge, respecting the rights of employees, consumers, and society in general. But the triple bottom line was a little different. So from a book called Cannibals with Forks in 1997, John Elkington put forward this idea of people, planet, and profit. And what made this different was that he was suggesting that these should all be of equal importance. So for people, an organization shouldn't exploit the stakeholders, so stakeholders being all of the people involved with the production of whatever the company produces, but should ideally contribute positively to their well-being along with everyone involved in production. And for the planet, not just cause no ecological harm, but limit energy consumption and waste, and carry out a full life cycle assessment of products. Then for profit, not just consider economic sustainability, because a company needs to be economically sustainable, otherwise it fails, and then that's no good to anyone. But beyond economic sustainability, look at economic capital alongside human capital, intellectual capital, social capital, natural capital. So he intended to foment complete system change. And when he came back to this in 2018, he was disappointed how companies just tried to balance these off one against another. But the suggestion from others in business ethics, like Dominic Millet, was that a company can follow a shareholder approach where they're trying to maximize the return to the shareholders in the company, or a stakeholder approach, trying to look at all these people involved in production and make sure that they're all looked after, or, excuse me, the common good approach, trying to look at the common good of everyone in society because we're all interconnected and we want our business to contribute to the common good. And he suggests that the common good and stakeholder approach doesn't mean ignoring shareholders, but it just means that they're just part of the consideration. And by taking ethics as a guide for human excellence, business ethics can be a guide for human excellence in business organizations. An ethical organization following the common good approach, this can be really positive. People want to contribute towards something they see as good. If a business is seen to contribute to the common good, that could give you a business advantage. Sustainability is nothing other than the common good for future generations, so they need to be taken into account. So from translation studies, our purview of quality has gradually expanded over time. We've moved from linguistic approaches from Catford in 1965 to functionalist approaches, so Rice and Vermeer, looking at the purpose of a translation, and that should be part of our idea of quality, to Tory and sociological approaches, looking at the poly system, our social and cultural context, expanding to cultural and political approaches, from Timoshko, and considering different relationships of power. From a very influential paper from Tradimatica, from a special issue from 2014 that focused on quality, Fields, Melby and others talked about 5 different approaches to quality that can be applied in the localization industry. So the sort of transcendent approach, this idea that it's self-evident what a good translation is. We can see the quality of a product. It's an innate characteristic. It's absolute and universally recognizable, but then ill-defined. Or product-based. So we quantify it based on certain ingredients or attributes as the end product. That's what we're looking for. And this sort of follows the error typologies like MQM. A user-based approach, the degree to which it satisfies users' needs or preferences. So this is a little bit more flexible depending on what our users are. A production-based approach views quality as conformance to requirements. So I mentioned ISO standards earlier. So if we have certain steps within our translation process, the assumption is that we'll have good quality at the end. If we have enough review steps, if we have enough sets of eyes on it. And then a value-based approach assesses quality in terms of costs and benefits. More benefits outweigh costs, the more product or service increases in value. So again, a bit more flexible. Another idea that was put forward from Christina Abdallah in 2007 and 14 was her 3-dimensional approach to quality. So we've got product quality. Does the product satisfy the stated needs? So similar to this product-based approach. Process quality, how is the work done? Back to our ISO standards, following certain steps. But she feels we need to be thinking of social quality, the interactions and relations of the people underneath the processes in the production network. So who does what and under what sort of circumstances? How are they feeling? How well are they treated? How well are they paid? What sort of conditions do they work within? And for her, this is something that we can't separate from process and product quality. So social quality will contribute. It'll affect the product quality. Another idea that we took into account was this idea of validity. So when we think of validity, when we're measuring something, it's basically thinking, does it measure what we purport to measure? But for Messick, coming from educational psychology, he suggested that key issues of test validity are the meaning, the relevance and utility of scores, the value implications of scores, if we're using them as a basis for action. So if we're using a score as a basis for doing something else, we need to think of what these implications are and the functional work of scores in terms of the social consequences of their use. So if we think, for example, of the paper from 2018 by Hani Hassan and others from Microsoft suggesting that they had reached human parity for machine translation for English Chinese news translation. And within that paper, they'd used a string-based metric, bleu, which even by then had been widely disparaged and it had been shown that it was pushing development in the wrong way. They'd used bleu to show that using this score, well, Chinese news translation had reached human translation quality. But then when it was delved in more deeply by Antonio Toral, by Shea Castillo, Samuel Lloydley and others, there were problems with the reference translations and they had only looked at these single sentences without their context. And if you look at them in context, there are loads of problems. But also, further within that paper from Hani Hassan and others, there was a sample evaluation using human metrics. So they'd use an error typology and they discovered that there were far more errors in the NMT output. But nonetheless, the heading, the title was, "We've reached human parity." This was reported without any critical input. It was uncritically reported by loads and loads of media, and that had real social consequences. So that makes us think, well, was that a valid measure? Was it measuring what it purported to measure? And it did have social consequences. It made people in companies think, well, why are we paying all these translators if we've reached human parity already? MT is a solved problem. Within the industry, we have problems with work being broken down into chunks, which isn't necessarily problematic for the output. It's achieving a fitness for purpose. If we look within this diagram from Unbabel of a customer relation text being submitted, it's machine translated, there's a quality estimation check. If individual segments are deemed not good enough, then decomposed sections of text are sent to the Unbabel community and those are recombined. And this fits with this notion from O'Brien from 2012 that in some domains, the notion of a text with a beginning, middle and end has changed radically. And from a respondent to Courtney and Phelan in 2019, a sense that translation is now more like working on an assembly line. In audiovisual translation, there are companies that since 2017-18 have been offering very quick turnaround, as little as 2-hour turnaround for the translation of 45-minute premium content. And this is done by breaking content down into 15-minute chunks, translating within a closed platform with the aid of wikis and neural machine translation. And it means that translators are working as quickly as possible on their 15-minute chunks. They don't see the full context. Within less than 2 hours, this is returned to a project manager who does a quick check, reassembles, and it goes out. And because of the way that AVT works, often this is a translation into English, and it's the pivot from which all other languages are created. And once something is translated once, it's unlikely to be translated again. So this has implications to do with motivation and satisfaction of workers, the sort of intrinsic motivation. We're motivated by feeling that we're contributing to something greater than ourselves, that we're contributing to something important, rather than just, you know, working as a cog in a machine, which is one of the respondents called this when I carried out a survey in 2019. We have certain expectations. So the norms of translation is that we have certain expectations of what a translation will look like. And that's what translators try to fulfill. But when translating within platforms, there's algorithmic management that mean that people are evaluated based on certain attributes, such as how quickly they return the work, how quickly they respond to messages, whether the translation is responded to in a timely fashion, whether they are polite in their emails. All of these attributes are included in how something like T-Rank by Translated will evaluate translators. And if this dictates whether a translator gets another job within that platform, my suggestion is that this will change the norm. So rather than conforming to the expectations of a translation, it's important to conform to the algorithmic norms that will dictate whether we get another job. Fulfilling the algorithmic requirements becomes a primary need. And we've seen this previously in digital platforms from Jarahi and Sutherland, how they found that the ability to understand and make use of algorithms has become a core competency of workers attempting to retain autonomy. Within platforms, according to Fair Work, the think tank based in Oxford, we see that a lot of platforms don't reach the minimum standards of fair work. So this is looking at fair pay, fair conditions, fair management, fair work-life balance. Translated worked and Creative Words worked with Fair Work to improve their terms and conditions to achieve most or all of these minimum standards, but a lot of these bigger platforms don't. And one problem that Creative Words have found is that while they've changed their terms and conditions, it hasn't given them any competitive advantage. So they're treating their workers more fairly, but you know, the translation buyers are not yet voting with their feet and trying to buy from an ethical platform. There's huge amounts of work in translation. Max Deryagan from ABTE said in 2021 that this should be a golden moment. We have insane volumes of work. Instead, we have widespread stress and burnout as subtitle translators try to make ends meet. Here's Minna Rukanen from her meta-evaluation, her meta-analysis with David Svan from 2024. If the translation profession is to survive, it needs to be perceived as being worthy of lifelong commitment. This can only be achieved if translators' passion for the intrinsic nature of their work is acknowledged and nurtured, which necessitates granting translators greater autonomy and power over their working conditions. But instead, we're seeing autonomy narrowing, that the amount of flexibility that translators have when working specifically within platforms is narrowing. So I talked about what motivates us in our work, and this is important for all of us as we're working. The things that motivate us positively are intrinsic: having challenging work, recognition, responsibility, working for, and something meaningful, being involved in decision making, and feeling that we're important to our organization. For us working in universities, that's important just as much as it is for translators. There are factors that will demotivate us if they're not satisfied, to do with status, pay, security, work conditions. But the most motivating factors are intrinsic. And the sort of idea of Taylorism, of Frederick Winslow Taylor, from the factory floor from 1911, was that the assumption that workers are primarily motivated by money and that improved rates of pay will compensate for reduced autonomy and repetitive work. But these days, in digital Taylorism, workers aren't even getting improved rates of pay, they just are having their autonomy reduced. And since the 60s, it's been clear that we need motivating job content to positively motivate us in our work. But if you're working with broken down chunks of work within a digital platform, your autonomy is really reduced, and you've got technologies imposed on you unilaterally by your employer, well, that's not going to be a positive benefit. And it's no wonder we're hearing anecdotal evidence of people leaving the profession. When we should be looking at work system sustainability. So instead of focusing exclusive on short-term static efficiencies, such as productivity, profitability, performance, we need to focus on long-term dynamic efficiencies, such as learning and innovation. And for a work system to be sustainable, it needs to attain a just balance in development between all stakeholders, the long and short-term needs. And this fits with our UN Sustainable Development Goals, which there have been loads of complaints about, but ultimately work systems are not sustainable if they don't try and balance all of these needs. And it's not something that we can just decide, well, this is where we're going to set our level. This is long-term and short-term balance. This is difficult. It'll need constant rebalancing as the factors around us change. And then another very important thing that we considered in our adaptation of the triple bottom line is environmental sustainability. So this widely cited paper by Emma Strubel and others from 2019 focused on prioritizing computationally efficient hardware and algorithms, and they estimated that a large transformer neural network model would produce the same emissions as 5 cars over the 20-year lifetime of those cars. And we've seen that LLMs are even more highly costly and ecologically supercharged. Sam Altman said that the cost to train GPT-4 was about $100 million. We've got huge amounts of GPUs being used for more recent GPT models. Last night, Gökhan, you were talking about the cost for Grok 3. So huge amounts of emissions. It also depends what the source of the energy is. So when Dimitar Shteryanov and Eva van Mattenhoven moved from Ireland to the Netherlands, they carried out the same experiment and looked at the source of the energy used. In Ireland, it happened to be from more renewable origin. In the Netherlands, more from fossil origins. But this should be taken in the context of our emissions per capita for different countries having huge amounts of emissions. Data center power use is anticipated to surge 6-fold in the next 10 years. According to the head of the National Grid in the UK, they feel that future growth will be in foundational technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. But, you know, for the amount of water used, for the amount of emissions, the amount of energy used, at the moment, AI is a fraction. So it's estimated that there's maybe about 100 mil used for one AI query or a generative AI query, whereas if we're on a Zoom call for an hour, well, that's going to use a number of liters. If we watch Netflix for 10 minutes, then that's over 2 liters. If we eat a burger, that's 600 gallons. So, I mean, we also have to take this in context that while it's important to reduce our emissions and the scale of AI will have a big effect, there are lots of, you know, lower hanging fruit that we can try and change to do with individual and group responsibilities, which are very much interlinked. At the moment in Ireland, there's a moratorium on building and opening more data centres. At the moment, 21% of our national energy capacity goes towards data centres. And fueled by AI, we're getting real pressure from big tech, who are very much present as employers in the Irish market. So there are 4,200 staff employed by Amazon in Ireland, And we're seeing these implicit threats in the newspapers that there's a major risk to Ireland as long as the data centre ban remains. We're seeing new data centres opening here. So Oxygen opening its largest data centre in Spain in Sant Cugat. Microsoft planning to pour 6.69 billion into new Spanish data centres. Anytime any new renewable capacity comes online, it's quickly bought up by big tech. So while they're trying to move towards net zero, that means that, you know, there's none of that capacity available to others. So we are very much implicated in this growth in data centers and the related emissions, even if the current use of AI for our individual queries is quite small. The suggestion from this from Andy Masley in terms of the CO2 avoided for personal lifetime decisions, asking ChatGPT 50,000 fewer questions will have a very small impression if we compare it to switching to green heating or living car-free or avoiding one transatlantic flight. So we do have to put this in context, especially when it comes to our individual decisions. But the problem is that this doesn't include the emissions to do with training. This is only looking at inference, the point at which we ask the question, and also systems becoming bigger and bigger, and the scale involved with more and more people using generative AI, and the push from our international organizations and governments to use more generative AI. I mentioned this to do with the use of water, how one hamburger requires 660 gallons. For those of us that don't eat meat, it's 90% taken off. But still, you know, a vegan burger still requires quite a lot of water. And this is also going to exacerbate the global digital divide between those who are offline and more likely to be affected by climate change and those who are online in wealthy countries. So, taking many of these things into mind, we put forward this idea of people, planet, and performance, adapting the triple bottom line, trying to ask the question for people, how does this large language model impact them? So not just translators, but platform workers, the sort of people who annotate. We're seeing the effects of reinforcement learning using human feedback. Initially, that was used to make sure that the LLMs didn't produce offensive, racist, culturally inappropriate output, but now we're starting to see this used for geopolitical interference, DeepSeek refusing to answer questions to do with Tiananmen Square, and we'll start to see that, no doubt, in Trump's America as the big tech companies fall in line with Trump's politics and make sure that it doesn't say something that's geopolitically insensitive. So it means there are a lot of people annotating to try and make sure that these guardrails are created for large language models, generally very poorly paid, in a place far from the developed world. There were a lot of people working on this in Kenya, on 0 hours contracts, and if they're seen to be complaining about their conditions, then their access to the platform suddenly disappears. So LLMs impact lots of people, those annotators, translators, platform workers, those whose data is dispossessed because it's all based on trawling as much data as possible. The planet in terms of energy costs, CO2 used, whether or not efficient models are used, and there is a prioritization of efficient models, but also the cost of ICT. There's a big push for trying to mine more rare metals. Again, geopolitics is involved in this agreement that the US and Ukraine are trying to come to for access to their rare metals. And then disposal. A lot of our ICT material is disposed in very unsafe circumstances in less developed countries. Then when we're looking at performance, we're looking at task-appropriate, comprehensive standards, not just using a metric that gives you a rough approximation, not just a string-based metric. And that these should be of equal importance. But the problem is that this can only really be a heuristic. It it can give us a guide. We can't be reductive enough to just attach a number to any of these, because that hides too much of the information. There's too much that we're trying to include. But it's important to try and include these in our evaluations and how we report the performance, not just focus on performance, but try and we report evaluations of technologies that we're working with and take this into account. There are companies that are trying to take ethics as a business model. There are cooperatives like Gorilla Translation or Gorilla Media more broadly. There's a small and growing selection of companies that are becoming B Corporation certified, which means that they foreground ethics and the common good as part of their mission. They're scored out of 200, and if they get over 80 across 5 different metrics, then they're allowed to be B Corp certified and need to recertify every 3 years. So if successful, excuse me, these could improve the outlook for the industry by being powerful exemplars of ethical behavior. But the challenge is to balance financial sustainability with ethical behaviors. And we've seen problems with this just in the last couple of years. So one of the most prominent translation companies that were B Corp certified was AJT Translations, based in the UK. And in 2023, in October, they received an Ethical Business Award, but just 12 months later, they announced that they were going out of business because they couldn't manage to balance financial sustainability with their ethical behaviors. And to publicly espouse ethical behaviors leaves companies open to challenge if they fall below their own standards. So an example here is a French-based company called Powerling that bought over another LSP and then didn't pay their legacy debts to freelance translators. The hype cycle, according to Gartner, for artificial intelligence has peaked for generative AI, falling towards the trough of disillusionment. So maybe we'll start to see more realism. But right now, in the translation industry, it's causing a lot of fear. It's perceived as a negative trend because of the amount of AI hype. So we're not really seeing realism, we're not seeing balance, and we're not seeing empirical assessment. This is some information from a report from the paper that's starting to suggest that the bubble is deflating, and the recent panic over DeepSeek exposes AI's weak foundation on the hype. So maybe we'll start to see a bit more realism kick in. This was just from the last couple of weeks. And I talked about how we're starting to perhaps see the limits of this focus purely on scale for large language models. And according to Ilya Sutskever, who was the CTO of OpenAI until recently, scaling the right thing matters now more than ever. So the age of scaling, we're back to the age of wonder and discovery. Everyone's looking for the next thing. We need to move beyond scaling. Although not everyone agrees. But of course, our option isn't just the largest of language models. We could try and use large language models that are closed source, that are maximized for performance based on a wide range of tasks with high environmental impact, not really understanding the true cost. We could look at open source models where the training data is transparent, where we can actually, to an extent, look under the hood. As I mentioned, there is a built-in opacity that's baked into neural networks, to machine learning, which means that we can't fully understand what's going on. But also large, small language models, bespoke language models with little environmental impact can actually be useful on more narrow gauge tasks. They might even outperform large language models on these narrow tasks. And it's possible to use open source models that give us a clear report of environmental impact. So we have that book that Gökhan mentioned that we just published earlier or in 2024, Automating Translation. One of my co-authors, Seamus Lankford, created Adapt MLLM, a multilingual large language model that produces a green report that makes it clear what the emissions are, what the environmental implications are, in as much as he could understand it, because of course we've got hugely distributed cloud networks on which these systems are usually trained. And you don't need to buy the book to read it because it's an open access paper. But in closing, Elkington, he stressed the need to change from an extractive approach to modes which over time actively rebuild economic, environmental, human and social capital. The standard in ethics used to be to do no harm, but now we've moved towards trying to actively do good to the society we're working in and to participants in our experiments, in our work. And Donella Meadows in 2001 talked about the importance of listening to what a system tells us, discovering how its properties and our values can work together to bring forth something much better than could ever be produced by our will alone. So working with a system doesn't necessarily mean being a complete technophobe, but we need to bring our values into this discussion and try and figure out how we can work positively with technologies rather than just accepting what's given to us and deciding that we're people without any control at all. We need to balance people, planet, and performance, and the question is how to do so. And hopefully this heuristic moves in the right direction. But ethical concerns need to be considered by us, by technology developers, translation buyers, agencies, translators, and consumers of translation. Myself and Gökhan are working on a paper to do with teaching the ethics of AI and translation. And one of the things I've been looking at is the pedagogy of implication, because we're all implicated as users of technology, and we do need to understand our position within the complex interaction of individual and global and corporate and business and national responsibilities. When we're teaching, our graduates will move into influential positions in the industry. So maybe right now, what effect they can possibly have is small, but perhaps when they move into influential positions in the industry, they can think about these ethical decisions and maybe have a framework behind how they'll evaluate technologies in the future. So can they bring forward evaluation beyond performance is a question. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.
It always happens, I know. Yeah, so just about the three bottom line that you mentioned, I know like big AI companies and specifically the engineers themselves, they love to compare how they perform usually in terms of quality. We talk about the quality, and we have quality metrics, both human and automatic metrics. But as you mentioned, the part with planet and people remains a bit heuristic. Do you think would it be in somehow create some benchmarks in these two domains to be able to evaluate, at least to be able to compare how different technologies perform?
That's the tricky part, because it's very reductive to try and just create a number and decide, well, this is what you're aiming for. We can't, we have to try and project what the effect will be of a technology on people, and the ways of doing that are time consuming and are inexact. So there are a number of different types of forecasting studies that are used within ethics. The one that our PhD student is using at the moment is, I'm trying to remember it, it's Philip Bray in 2012 was the person who put it forward. I can't think of the name of it. Anyway, there's maybe sort of 4 different types of forecasting studies where we try and predict those effects. But that's very inexact. We try and talk to experts in doing so. If you look within the translation industry, it's a huge industry with lots of different people working in different conditions. How would we try and reduce that to a single number? And people have tried to do that in some way. That's the purpose of these systems of automatic job allocation, to try and create an algorithm that looks at loads of different proxies for translator behavior, things like replying to your email in time, being polite, saying hello at the beginning of an email, also then quality of your translation, but actually that's only a very small part of it. and that is usually sort of baked into an algorithm which isn't available to everyone to create this score. And then, you know, certain ones above a level will be offered jobs, below won't be offered jobs. So that, you know, that's so reductive that, you know, that you can see how there could be problems there. If someone has a bereavement, if someone's sick for a while, then their quality, maybe their response rate will get slower. Even if the quality of their translation doesn't get worse, maybe they're not so quick responding to email. Very quickly you fall below a line, and then you're never offered jobs again. So I think that's just too reductive, and that's the problem with trying to, you know, it's so easy to give a performance score. It's not so easy with people and with planet. There are attempts to create energy intensity scores, and Sasha Lucioni from Hugging Faces is involved with that, and lots of others. So that is an active area of research.
Thank you. Any questions, comments? Please.
Thanks, Josh, for an inspiring talk. I couldn't agree more with your perspective. You have focused in your talk on machine translation, but as you said, this perspective could be applied to other linguistic technology. In my case, for example, I don't work specifically on machine translation, but I work on plain language technology. And we have nowadays different systems based on rule-based systems, machine translation systems. But from 2 years, we have an explosion of artificial intelligence system with large language models. And I am seeing that these companies or these governments who are developing this kind of tools are developing the tools but without an empirical assessment. And everybody's using these tools, but we are trying to offer some benchmarks or metrics to evaluate this kind of tools. And I am wondering if you have any advice for us in this case.
I think it's such a sensitive area for plain language, because the audiences that you're trying to cater to, you know, ideally you'd have human evaluation, but it's a mixed audience. And, you know, people who have cognitive impairments, you know, to what extent do you want to use them as testers to see how well they understand things? But I think this, first of all, I don't see why you couldn't apply the sort of the triple bottom line idea to but for people with different sorts of special needs or accessibility needs, it's something I'm sure you're doing. It's, you know, it's so important to have really careful testing with users, and sometimes I've seen examples where you know that isn't taken into account at all. So, for example, we had a project in DCU called the Sign-On project. I should probably be closer to the laptop over here, where they created avatars for signing, and then tested them with deaf viewers, and found that the deaf viewers were really unhappy with these avatars, for reasons that are quite obvious when you think about it. That, you know, people use body language in signing, their facial expression changes. They kind of act out something, you know, as opposed to it's not just the signs themselves. So therefore, these avatars are, you know, you're losing so many dimensions of the communication, and yet there's been an interest in using avatars because it's so expensive to get signers for media, and there's a lack of signers, even if there was enough money to pay for them. So I think similarly for like plain language, you know, there needs to be really careful and comprehensive testing with users, rather than an assumption that you can just, you know, hit some benchmark, which is, you know, could be quite arbitrary. But is that what you're finding? I mean, what's happening currently in plain language? I'm not on top of this at all.
In plain language, we are doing tests with users to assess if they understand better the texts that are adapted to plain language. This is one of our research lines. But also, we are trying to develop sort of metrics to evaluate the quality of the change done that these systems can do. So this is a double research line.
Yeah. I think the problem also with using machine learning is just that it's a little unpredictable. So every time something is produced, it's new. There's a risk that it could be, something odd could happen. And so if you're going to use these technologies without oversight, there's always going to be this element of risk involved.
I know.
And I'm very uncomfortable, with that, especially for vulnerable users. As I'm sure you are too. So it's in that way it's sort of worrying times, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I mean, there are also times when maybe there might be a conflict between. So, for example, I was talking to Gökhan last night about a study I'm involved with Harvard Children's Hospital and Boston Medical School, where they found that there were negative repercussions to pediatric translation needs. So when patients were ready to leave the hospital, they needed to be given patient discharge instructions. The most popular languages were Spanish, Portuguese, Haitian Creole, and Arabic. But there were negative implications with the wait for translation. So patients would have to wait an extra number of days, maybe even over a week. They might catch a hospital bug. They couldn't start the recovery sooner. There were extra costs with staying in hospital because they had to wait for these translations. So they wanted to see about using LLMs for these translations. And they did a test of LLMs using blood scores. So the human translations, they produced the LLM translation, and they were automatically comparing them and saying, well, that looks okay. And they published based on that. And then I got in touch with them, and then we started doing fine-grained evaluations using MQM, so an error typology. So the first thing they discovered was that the human translations that they assumed were perfect had loads of errors in them, even though they were translated and reviewed. And when they did LLM translations for Spanish, at least, there were the same number of errors and the same number of major errors. Thankfully, no critical errors, but the same number of major errors. So that would suggest that by publishing this, we're kind of putting translators out of work, because we're saying, well, this needs oversight. We need someone to check it. And that's a legal requirement in the US, but we do have to worry that maybe readers might be in a different country where there isn't that legal requirement. We're still saying, well, you're going to get just as good results for English-Spanish translation with a very detailed prompt for these specific instructions. But this is where you balance, the potential benefits to the kids who are stuck in hospital versus translators. The result is the result. And if it's better to use an LLM, maybe it's better to use an LLM with oversight. That isn't a good result for translators, but there are better health outcomes for kids. So it'd be unethical for us not to publish that research. So it's not that using the technology is always bad, but we were just very careful in our evaluation, and we tried to follow what we considered best practice. And the result was the result.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Have you been able to look at the AI Act, just like the AI Act from European Union, and whether it has any touching lines with the three bottom line that you mentioned?
It does. So automatic job allocation is forbidden. I mentioned Translated and their T-rank system. they've never fully automated job allocation. Other companies have, and there was a paper by Sarah Herbert, Felix de Carmo, and others in Jostrans in 2023, where they evaluated a system with a company that intended to move towards automatic job allocation. So it does happen within the translation industry, and that's considered a high-risk use of AI and is forbidden within the AI Act. However, I think even if the automatic tool suggests a translator to be chosen, it'll be difficult for a project manager to go the other way. So when Alessandro Catalan presented about T-Rank in 2017, he said that the T-Rank system performed as 54%. What was it? It was like the sort of, it performed as well as 54% of their project managers. Their best project managers would choose a little better. But I think the problem is that if you have a system that's telling you to choose a certain translator, first of all, you're more likely to follow that.
Yeah.
But second of all, if you think, well, I'm going to ignore that and make a different decision, then you're taking on a responsibility as a project manager. And if something goes wrong, then that's your problem. If you just followed what the system tells you and something goes wrong, well, the system told me to do that. So our project manager is going to take on that risk. So it does have an effect, but not a huge one. But I haven't looked into it enough, and I haven't looked into what other things might be considered high risk uses of AI. And the problem, which is what we're seeing, I think, with copyright as well, the fact that, essentially rules of copyright are being completely ignored for AI, and different countries are kind of creating bespoke rules. Like in Japan, if any data is in country, that's kind of legally allowed to be used for AI training. Is that no one wants to be seen to stifle innovation, that it's, they've placed their bets on generative AI as something to stimulate growth, and now it would be an embarrassment to backtrack. So for now, if you put too many guardrails on it, it's seen as stifling innovation. And we're seeing that with, J.D. Vance's speech, in Germany the other day, where he's talking about how, Europe's putting all these guardrails up. We need, unfettered innovation. That's what, that's what's going to bring us forward. And that's, that seems to be the plan for the US. It's why they're limiting chips to be exported to China and not limiting them for other countries, because, they want control. They believe in AGI, even if many of us don't.
Okay, any other questions? No, I guess we can continue after the talk with our questions. So I guess to sum up, less burger, less AI for us. Well, thank you very much for coming, all of you. And also thanks a lot, Jos, for coming from Ireland to here at the cost of increasing your carbon footprint. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for the